motion be agreed to. Call Phil Twyford.
Mr Speaker, I'm standing in for my colleague, the Honourable Annette King, and I rise to express Labour's opposition to this bill. Sir, Labour would support a bill that promotes efficient, effective and accountable local government, but this bill is not that. Sir, this is a politicised attack on local government. It will undermine democratic processes and it takes away the democratic rights of local communities. The reforms in this bill, sir, are based on a manufactured set of statistics, selective use of data by the Honourable Nick Smith, in a way, sir, that it has become that minister's trademark. We saw it earlier in the last parliamentary term with his stewardship of the ACC. Sir, he whips up a few shonky figures, puts them out into the media, scaremongers up a good crisis, and then pretends to bring a solution, sir. And that's exactly what happened here. Although it is interesting to note that after the data that these reforms were based on were posted to the DIA website, a better local government document, sir, a few days after that document's release, the data was replaced by DIA with a comment saying, and I quote directly from the website, "There are issues with the data, both in terms of accuracy and in terms of the picture that was being given for some councils." Not a very promising start to this government's local government reform agenda in its second term. So the main issue that I want to speak to in this contribution is about the powers and proposals for the change to the rules around the reorganisation and amalgamation of local councils, sir. Currently, the law guarantees to all citizens in this country the right to a say in a binding ballot over any proposed reorganisation or amalgamation of their local council. This bill takes away that right. It is the confiscation of the democratic rights of New Zealanders, and it opens the door to forced amalgamations in which the citizens of the affected areas will risk having no say at all. Let me repeat, sir, at the moment, citizens are guaranteed the right to have a say. They can vote up or down any amalgamation proposal. And what did we see? This government in 2009, they circumvented that right, sir, with the forced amalgamation in Auckland. And what are they doing? They're incorporating that approach into this piece of law. If citizens want to have a say, then they have 40 working days from the time the organisational change proposal is tabled. They've got 40 working days to get 10% of the local voting population to sign a referendum seeking the right to have a say in a binding ballot, sir. And that is simply not good enough. This is an assault on the democratic rights of communities all around New Zealand. It opens the door to forced amalgamations, and that is a broken promise by this government. We heard last term, we heard John Key, we heard other national ministers saying there would be no forced amalgamations. And John Key said in March this year, and I quote from his post-cabinet press conference, "We think it's very difficult for communities to amalgamate. Again, there'll be some discussions about that with the councils to amalgamate, but I wouldn't look for a forced situation as you saw in Auckland." Well, that, sir, is exactly what this bill opens the door to. It takes away the democratic right of New Zealanders to choose the shape and the scale of their local authorities. It takes away their right to a binding ballot. That opens the door to forced amalgamations. It's exactly what John Key promised would not happen. That, sir, has become this government's modus operandi. We saw it in Auckland, and we saw it in Christchurch with the sacking of Environment Canterbury, the removal of the elected councillors of the Canterbury region. And we see that same contempt for democratic values, the same contempt for our democratic institutions. It's coming through loud and clear in the Honourable Nick Smith's reform agenda brought to the House today by the Minister David Carter. There is lots more that's wrong with this bill, sir, and I want to focus on a couple of other elements. What we see in this bill is the reincarnation of Rodney Hyde's ludicrous core services agenda, and it survives here in a diluted form, but it still, what it does is that it gets rid of the purpose statement in the current local government legislation, which is often referred to as the four well-beings. It replaces that with a narrower focus of providing good quality infrastructure plus local public services and regulatory functions at the least possible cost to households and businesses. Well, as many commentators have already pointed out, sir, this is a nonsense. The regulatory impact statement says this change is likely to have a symbolic effect and should not affect council business as usual. Now, the absurdity of this provision is illustrated by the interview that the Minister gave on Q&A a few weeks ago. He was asked what sort of council activity he didn't approve of, and his example that he gave was the Hamilton V8 races. Apparently, councils running V8 races is bad. But the Christchurch Flower Show, that's really good. This illustrates the absolute intellectual bankruptcy, sir, that underpins this bill. V8 races are out, flower shows are in. So this is the kind of intellectual rigour, that we've come to expect from this national government. Nick Smith, who's often touted as having the biggest brain in the National Cabinet when he was in the Cabinet, if he's responsible for this reform agenda and he's the brightest guy in the National Cabinet, then this country's got something very serious to worry about. The Department of Internal Affairs in the regulatory impact takes a much more sober assessment, sir, of this issue, and it says, and I quote, "There is no clear quantitative evidence to suggest that the Local Government Act 2002 has resulted in a proliferation of new activities or that local government is undertaking a wider group of functions." So that the regulatory impact statement by the Minister's own officials contradicts the very premise that this reform agenda is based on, that Nick Smith went around the country saying that the sky's going to fall, councils are out of control, they're spending here and there, they're profligate. The four well-beings have led to an explosion of council activity doing all these outrageous things, and it's contradicted by the Minister's own officials and the regulatory impact statement. Right. The other main idea that underpins this bill, sir, and this reform agenda is the notion that council debt is out of control, and that councils are racking up more and more debt, and this is a terrible liability. Well, sir, we've seen from Local Government New Zealand clear evidence that local authority expenditure as a percentage of GDP is more or less static at around 3%, sir, and has been for the last 5 years. We see local authority expenditure as a percentage of total Crown expenditure is more or less static. In fact, it's gone down by several percent in the last 5 years. The figures show that council expenditure on interest repayments as a percentage of operating income was 4.53 in 2010, up from 4.19 in 2009. It's hardly a crisis, sir. And the irony is at a time when councils are being diddled out of a fair share of funding for local roads, which for many councils is up to half their operating expenditure. This government is beating them with a stick about over-expenditure when it's cutting back on the funds that they rely on just to repair and maintain local roads. So the sinister thing about this budget is that it's designed to put the fiscal squeeze on local authorities at the very time that this government is trying to pressure councils in Auckland and Christchurch and goodness knows where else to sell assets that their ratepayers have paid for and built up over generations. This government is trying to do to local government what it's doing to central government, and that's sell off the family silver, sell off lucrative assets that are owned by the people of those communities, sir. This is an illogical, poorly thought through bill, sir. It takes away the democratic rights of communities. It undermines local government, and Labor will not support it.
Call Nikki Wagner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's very interesting to listen to